Alright, so what exactly were the Nephilim, and why doesn't anyone ever talk about them? They seem like kind of a big deal as far as history goes. So that's a question I found on Reddit, and I went, yeah, that's a good question. And it may not get explained often enough. In actual truth, it is a very well-known story, and a fairly well documented and examined bit of scripture in the Old Testament, which is well known amongst scholarly circles and a lot of the more theological Christian traditions, but certainly in general popular Christian books or your average Sunday service or your like a regular church experience, it really doesn't get talked about very often. If you don't know what it is, the Nephilim first show up in Genesis chapter 6, and they also show up in Numbers 13, and so it's the only two places where the word Nephilim is used in the Bible, both in the Old Testament. So the story goes, well, I'll read the Genesis 6 bit. Where does that go to? Genesis 6, 1 to 4. Yeah, so it's 2 paragraphs. Then the people began to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw the beautiful women and took any they wanted as their wives. Then the Lord said, My spirit will not put up with humans for such a long time, for they are only mortal flesh. In the future, their normal lifespan will be no more than 120 years. Jeez, excuse me. In those days, and for some time after, giant Nephilites lived on the earth. For whenever the sons of God had intercourse with women, they gave birth to children who became the heroes and famous warriors of ancient times. Right. And then I'll go to the bit in Numbers quickly as well, because why not? I'm not in a rush, and if you were, you wouldn't be on the internet. So when they send the scouts out to explore Canaan in Numbers, to explore the promised land after leaving the desert, the spies come back with a report. I'll go from verse 30 in chapter 13. Oh man, sneezing, jeez. But Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. Let's go at once to take the land, he said. We can certainly conquer it. But the other men who'd explored the land with him disagreed. We can't go up against them, they're stronger than we are. Yada yada. So they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we travelled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers, and that's what they thought too. So that phrase there in verse 33, we even saw giants. In the Hebrew it says Nephilim. In the translator's tradition was that it was giants. Oh, that's just gross, excuse me. In chapter 6, it uses the word Nephilim, doesn't it? The Nephilites. The sons of God saw the beautiful women, daughters of men. Yeah. So that's the only two places that the word Nephilim shows up. The Nephilim is a plural, for a group of people. But there's two main theories of who or what the Nephilim are. And the first one is that they're angels or the sons of angels. And human women as mothers who produce literal giants like Goliath of Gath, and the Raphaites and Anakites and Zanzamites and the rest of the so-called giant tribes. A lot of this idea of the Nephilites being angels comes from what you would call Enochian literature, which is, if you know the genealogies, in Genesis 5 actually, you've got Enoch. Verse 21. And then there's a bunch of other books, the Gospel of Enoch, Wisdom of Enoch, or whatever it's called. There's a bunch of them, which aren't in the Bible. Some references in the Talmud, the Dead Sea Scrolls, some other Aramaic sources. They're often described as fallen angels, so i.e. that is, the devil and his followers were kicked out of heaven, and one of the first things they did when they came to earth long ago was, make babies. The other thing is, the phrase sons of God is a fairly common phrase, and it doesn't have to just apply to spiritual beings or angels. It can apply to kings or warriors or famous people or accomplished warriors, prophets, maybe priests, kind of almost anyone who's really, really notable. The other main theory is that the Nephilites or the Nephilim are the sons of Seth, Adam's third son. Apparently this also pops up in the Dead Sea Scrolls in some portions. I think Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine, had this view, that the Nephilim are descended from an intermarriage of the line of Seth and Cain, and at some point in history, not spoken of in the Bible, that these people were condemned by God for some rebellion. I don't know a whole lot about it. I think the Ethiopian Orthodox Church holds the Seth view. It might be the other one. So this Nephilim only pops up twice, and it could be. It might also just be a reference to people who are just bigger and better fed than what the Israelites were at the time, or it might be how the Israelite scribes described a very warlike and martial people. Like when the Greeks first came up against the Mycenae, the Mycenae civilization, and they found these huge walls built of stones that were bigger than any they'd ever seen, and they said a Cyclops must have built these walls. And I think even today you still call walls with big stones with no brick or mortar Cyclopean walls, and they thought their enemies were all giants. And I think a similar thing might have happened in Numbers with the Israelites moving into Canaan, because they'd survived 400 years of slavery, walked around in the desert for 40 years, had started to move into the promised land, and discovered these people who were better organized, better fed, better warriors, great martial ability, and we're just a more developed and intimidating civilization than what they're used to. And I think it might be a bit of that as well. In Genesis 6:2, there's the phrase, "The sons of God saw the beautiful women and took any they wanted as their wives." So some commentators on the text have said this could be a reference to the Babylonian king's right of the first night. This is referred to in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Babylonian history. The king could apparently sleep with any woman on the first night she gets married before her husband could, which would drive me mental if I was ever going to get married. Could you imagine being engaged to a woman to marry, and then you know that the first thing you're going to have to do after the wedding is give it to the king? Or maybe you don't know, maybe the king will just rock up and say, she's mine for the first night. And then there's some speculation that this is part of a kind of fertility ritual, because kings are often referred to as sons of gods, or sons of the gods, or sons of Jupiter, or whatever particular patron god they have. So this could also be a fertility rite to bless the family, or to create powerful progeny for their nation, or for the king's army, or for the honor of the families being married together, or something like that. And if there is any religious connotation there, then it would be thus condemned by the Jews, particularly the scribes writing down the Bible at the time. I think it's important to note that the Genesis passage is about this passage, like the first 6 chapters, 7, 8 chapters. This is about God. This is about the creation stories. God creating, man rejecting God, and then the degeneration of humanity into the flood, into the time of Noah and the flood. So the writer isn't trying to teach us about ethnicity, mating habits of supernatural beings, or anything like that. It's about how God made us, how humanity rejected God, and how it fell apart as a result. As far as I know, etymologists aren't really sure what the word means. In the Hebrew, in Numbers and Genesis, it still says Nephilim in both. It doesn't say giants, it doesn't say sons of God. That's how we've interpreted it. And there's a whole bunch of words that it sounds like, sons of God being one and giants another. I think it's more likely that it was written just to describe people who were just bigger and scarier and musclier and better with swords and spears than what the Israelites were, generally, even though that may not be the strict meaning of the word itself. So that's basically what I think, for what it's worth. It's a cool story. It's really interesting. It's an insight into a lot of the oral tradition and the folk stories the Jews had, which aren't in the Bible. There's all this backstory to the Bible, which just wasn't referred to because it wasn't deemed necessary, because the Bible was written mainly for Jewish people or for Christians in the early church. And there's all this backstory that today we don't get unless we've got, access to these Dead Sea Scrolls or the rabbinic traditions, or that kind of thing. So anyway, I hope you find that helpful. Genesis 6 and Numbers 13. I've been Acoustic Pants, and videos are out Wednesday, Sunday, and I will see you next time. Talk about them. They seem like kind of a big deal as far as history goes. So that's a question I found on Reddit, and I went, yeah, that's a good question. And it may not get explained often enough. In actual truth, it is a very well known in Numbers 13, and so it's the only two places where the word Nephilim is used in the Bible, both in the Old Testament. So the story goes. Well, I'll read the Genesis 6 bit. Where does that go to? Genesis 6, 1 to 4. Yeah. General, popular Christian books, or your average Sunday service, or your, like a regular church experience. It really doesn't get talked about very often. If you don't know what it is, the Nephilim first show up in Genesis chapter 6. And they also show up story and a fairly well documented and examined bit of scripture in the Old Testament, which is well known amongst scholarly circles and a lot of the more theological Christian traditions, but certainly in Alright, so what exactly were the Nephilim, and why doesn't anyone ever